I have a purring cat in my lap. There's worse ways to start a video. I had some expectations for this series that were thoroughly dashed against the rocks by what we're covering today. Not by anything in particular in the book, more in how I'm responding to it. Somewhat naively, I thought I'd be able to cover everything I needed to in this book in 4 videos, which means that this video would have been the last one. This video is covering 1 chapter. 1. Although I shouldn't be surprised. This is the chapter where we talk about the therapist's purported role in this epidemic. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to the channel. We are continuing this increasingly deep cognitive psych dive into Abigail Shrier's Irreversible Damage. There's 2 bits of channel business before we get into the video proper. First, you may or may not be aware that Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life sequel is coming out at the beginning of March, and we're going to talk about it. So depending on how the next piece of information goes, the next video uploaded might be Irreversible Damage, it might be a 12 Rules sequel video. Just know, I am going to finish Irreversible Damage. It's just, it won't be the only thing we're talking about on the channel, so we'll be alternating those for a bit, just as a heads up. Second, what was a previously okay managed chronic pain condition has turned into what feels like a part-time job, care of my doctor moving away and getting assigned a new doctor. So there's a lot of bureaucratic hoop jumping happening right now to try to continue treatment because I guess rules changed or something. So I have many meetings this week with various people, and hopefully I'll know what's going on with it in the near future and how much of a continuing time sink this is going to be for me. Hopefully not much, but stay tuned, I guess. And that's enough channel business for now. So let's get started with the reminder for the visual shorthand I use in these videos. This means I'm talking references. Sometimes it means science, especially if it's stuff I'm bringing to the discussion, but for roughly half of Shrier's citations, it's not science. This means I'm sharing my opinion, either in response to research or what I have paraphrased from the book. Alrighty, time to talk about the shrinks and everybody else who isn't a psychiatrist but is bundled in here too. We start this chapter with what Shrier calls an absurdist joke.
A woman walks into a therapist's office, dragging her teenage son. "Doctor," she says, "please help. My son thinks he's a chicken." The son says, "If there's one thing I can tell you about chickens, it's that we know who we are." "Where's your proof?" the woman demands of her son. "You have no feathers." "True," the son replies. "I went through the wrong puberty." The woman turns to the therapist. "You see what I mean? He's lost his mind." The therapist replies, "You're the one arguing with the chicken."
It's like she knows the attack helicopter joke is gauche at this point, but still wanted to be funny. But no, we're not going to beat this pile of garbage assembled as a horse further. Shrier tries to argue that this joke is what's happening with affirmative care, that treating a trans person in accordance with their gender identity is equivalent to treating the child in this joke as a chicken. This is going to be a rough chapter. At least I've got a kitty. She points out that we don't get to change our bodies, so some discomfort in how they feel or change over time is to be expected. Additionally, she refers back to the trans adults she spoke to and indicates that their gender dysphoria was excruciating. For them, the adults had excruciating gender dysphoria. And she says that transition was helpful for them, and also remarks that mental health professionals need to be sympathetic, respectful, and understanding. Shrier seems to get hung up on the language again. You wouldn't. Where are you going? Aww.
But the new affirmative care standard of mental health professionals is a different matter entirely. It surpasses sympathy and leaps straight to demanding that mental health professionals adopt their patients' beliefs of being in the wrong body. Affirmative therapy compels therapists to endorse a falsehood. Not that a teenager feels more comfortable presenting as a boy, but that they actually are a boy.
If you aren't familiar with the language hang-up I'm referring to here, I'm talking about the very basic level explanation of how it feels to be trans. The shorthand of this is being born in the wrong body. However, this is just the quick and dirty way to get across the complex feelings and sensations that go along with a trans identity, as described by ContraPoints or intimated by trans or non-binary TikTokers. Going through the intricacies of the trans or NB experience takes many more words than the 6 required for being born in the wrong body. And there are pieces exploring and expanding on this for those willing to invest some time in it. But Shrier seems only willing to work with the shorthand version. There is a difference between being more comfortable presenting as a boy and identifying as trans or non-binary. It's possible for someone to be assigned female at birth, identify as a girl or a woman, but still be more comfortable presenting as a boy or a man. We touched on this in the last video. The rigid gender roles and norms are becoming more fluid, so a person doesn't have to constrain themselves to whatever things may be associated with the box they were put in at birth. Shrier's insistence that biological sex determines gender fits in with that idea that whatever you're assigned at birth is what you get. However, my understanding is that feeling trans or non-binary is so much more than just feeling more comfortable presenting as a boy. Shrier's continuing insistence that this youth identifying as a boy is a falsehood has not been substantiated.
This is not a subtle distinction, and it isn't just a matter of humoring a patient. The whole course of appropriate treatment hinges on whether doctors view the patient as an AFAB child suffering mental distress or a boy in an AFAB youth's body. But the affirmative care standard, which chooses between these diagnoses before the patient is even examined, has been adopted by nearly every medical accrediting organization.
She then lists off the medical or psychological associations who have backed gender-affirming care for, quote, patients who self-identify as transgender or self-diagnose as gender dysphoric. And she takes issue that the World Professional Association for Transgender Health says that patients should have some say in how their treatment progresses. While complaining, at length, about the health situation I mentioned at the start of the video, a doctor friend, who's not in the US, commented that she was under the impression that medicine was moving away from this paternalistic model of healthcare that Shrier's wishing was in place here. And while I do think a doctor or mental health professional's training and expertise should help decide a person's treatment plan, I also think the person themselves should have a say in the treatment plan too. One might even be so bold as to say that it's their body. They should have the ultimate say in what's being done to it, assuming that they are capable of providing consent and making rational decisions. A little note before the big point. This insistence that the patient be examined first seems to echo things that we've seen already in the book, like Littman's insistence that all other possibilities be ruled out before it even be considered that a child who says they're trans is trans. Sure, it is true that there is a world of difference in what constitutes appropriate treatment based on the care provider's ideology regarding trans or NB people. Shrier's seemingly favorite Ontarian psychologist Zucker demonstrates that all too well. In case that name hasn't burned itself into your brain, he was the doctor who had a gender clinic in Toronto that was closed down when Ontario banned conversion therapy. But as indicated by her list of medical and psychological groups that endorse affirmative care as the appropriate treatment to use, this isn't so much an issue of ignoring a diagnosis so much as that other diagnosis not even being on the table. Shrier takes issue with the 2015 American Psychological Association's guidelines for transgender care, particularly the parts where, in Shrier's opinion, the APA tasks practitioners to, quote, adopt gender ideology themselves. This article is basically setting the APA strong suggestions for treating trans or gender nonconforming clients. I initially had standard there, but there is a portion in here laying out the difference between a standard and a guideline. Part of it is to bring people up to speed on the current understanding of gender identity, and this is where Shrier's problem is. By adopting a standard definition that takes trans or non-binary identities as valid, in Shrier's apparent view, they are enabling psych disorders. Even though this is the industry standard, as she laid out herself, and part of this document highlights the potential impacts personal biases or beliefs could have on care. And the APA moved away from looking at a trans or non-binary identity itself as disordered. The only thing that counts as a psychological disorder at this point is gender dysphoria. Just look at many of my past doctors who didn't think my nerve pain was real and how that impacted their treatment plan for me. I don't know how many times I got sent away with ibuprofen in some form when that doesn't work. So if you're seeking gender-affirming care and treatment in some way, and your practitioner does not heed the APA guidelines, they may not take your problem seriously, and so you won't be given appropriate treatment. Her first point of comparison here is in treating anorexia, with as much decorum as you might expect at this point. The gist is Shrier asking the reader to imagine that the APA changed its guidelines so that the therapist affirms the person with anorexia's belief that they are overweight, and also to change the context for what being fat means. Jesus Christ, Shrier. I think she keeps going back to eating disorders as an example because she made the link in the intro that the youth of today who are identifying as trans are equivalent to the youth of my day who would have picked up an eating disorder. These aren't the same situations. She didn't establish then that being trans is equivalent to an eating disorder, so she doesn't get to keep making that assertion as if she did. But it gets worse. Her second comparison point is a black child wanting to, quote, become white due to, quote, internalizing the racism of her peers. Shrier includes an action plan for this kid, including a name change, cosmetic and surgical procedures, and the intentionality of this cringe doing nothing to lessen it, this hypothetical child saying, "I'm basically white already." Reference 4 contains 2 articles, although we'll be discussing 3. The first is a paper from the 1960s that is a hot mess. Basically, the author concluded that from the way black boys were playing with a black and white puppet, in addition to some analysis of things the children said, but mostly puppets, that the majority in the sample were experiencing color conflict and wanted to be white. From a modern perspective, this paper gets promptly filed in the yikes bin. Many of the assumptions or arguments read as ignorant at best. The second is a paper where the one and only Zucker is responding to another paper, and this other paper is an informative and juicy one, so that's where we're diving in. Also, it may be illustrative to go through at least one Zucker paper to see a sense of how his arguments tend to go, as he is frequently cited by Shrier. The paper he's responding to is called How Dresses Can Make You Mentally Ill, Examining Gender Identity Disorder in Children, and basically argues that a transgender identity in youth doesn't have a place in the DSM. DSM is short for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is put out by the American Psychiatric Association and tries to define and classify psychological disorders. In case you don't have the different editions of the DSM memorized, this article was published during the text revision period of the 4th edition, known as the DSM-4 TR. As discussed in my DSM video, the change from the 3rd to 4th edition saw a bit of overhauling in a lot of the DSM, including how a person's sexual orientation was viewed. So it went from same gender attraction being an item in the DSM to not. But as mentioned in the last Shrier video, there appears to be a time lag for the view on transgender identity, so here we are. I'll also mention at the outset here that this paper is couched in the language of the time, so I'll be switching out boys and girls for AMAB and AFAB in discussing it. This paper mentions the disparity between referral rates in AMAB and AFAB youth, noting that it's probably due to greater social acceptance of nonconforming behavior among girls, and echoing the idea of gender identity and gender identity disorder in children, or GIDC, being a social construct. It goes through the different criteria kids have to meet for diagnosis, including what constitutes sufficient cross-gender identification, what qualifies as persistent discomfort with assigned sex or gender, that the child must not be intersexed, and that there must be some form of social dysfunction. Caution is also noted so that children who are gender role nonconforming are not assigned this diagnosis, nor children just wanting the cultural advantages associated with the other gender. The authors discuss the history of the GIDC diagnosis, with it first appearing in the 3rd edition, noting the difference between how AMAB and AFAB youth were diagnosed. They also highlight that the DSM-4-TR includes GIDC as the youth variant of gender identity disorder, as the research indicated a continuity in features from young to adult groups. This paper touches on the issues of reliability and validity for the GIDC diagnosis. So, in this context, reliability means that a kid will be consistently diagnosed with GIDC or not, with visits between one mental health practitioner over time or between mental health practitioners who are diagnosing this kid. So either they're consistently diagnosed or they're not. That means it would be a reliable diagnosis. Validity is a different beast. So with this, we're talking about whether GIDC is an actual psychological disorder as described in the DSM, or if it's not. This paper calls into question the reliability of the GIDC diagnosis for AMAB and AFAB youth. The clinic providing most of this reliability data is not explicitly named, but the references tend to have Zucker in the author list somewhere, so it's probably from the Toronto clinic he was a part of. With respect to the validity of the GIDC diagnosis, it's noted that the validity measures are coming from Zucker's work, and the measures were based on parental self-report. It's amazing how far back that phenomenon goes. Is it any wonder there's such an emphasis now on listening to the child about how they feel? The authors argue that part of the problem in the validity of the GIDC diagnosis is tied into whether or not a trans identity is abnormal behavior. If it is abnormal, then it would be sufficiently deviant from normal behavior and thus a valid diagnosis. If it isn't abnormal, then it wouldn't be disordered behavior and therefore not a valid diagnosis. Furthermore, they note that what is considered gender appropriate has shifted over time, and again, that gender itself is a social construct. Related to this is the idea that each gender has certain ways to behave, so if a child is not meeting those expectations, it would be viewed as indicating pathology. In a section asking if the GIDC diagnosis is needed, the authors highlight the forms treatment has taken, particularly in Zucker's approach. You want it? Good job. Social ostracism. Social ostracism. Social ostracism. Which is what you're going to get if you walk on my keyboard. Specifically, that treatment is to reduce their experience of social ostracism and its psychopathological sequelae, or to prevent their becoming either homosexual or transsexual adults. The authors note that if a child is brought into treatment because the parents are afraid they will grow up to be gay, the parents should be the focus of treatment, not the child. Specific to trans children, the stress of being a trans adult and the procedures typically undertaken in transition provide adequate rationale for attempting to prevent children from becoming transsexual. The preference towards disconfirming treatment with the goal of conformity is noted. The authors suggest that the addition of GIDC was a way to continue to treat and receive payment for treating gender atypical children given the removal of same-sex attraction from the DSM. The historical association between same-gender attraction and a gender nonconforming childhood is discussed, including a rather Freudian argument from the late 80s that gender atypical behavior in AMAB children is preceded and caused by sexual attraction to their fathers. This section concludes with the comment that if gender nonconforming behavior is a part of normal proto-gay children, therapeutic intervention should focus on supporting their development to become healthy gay adults. The next section explores if the GIDC diagnosis is harmful to children. It's noted that it might be primarily harmful through the stigmatizing nature of being labeled as having disordered behavior, or that their own sense of self is abnormal, the latter potentially driving their feelings regarding gender underground. The parallels between treatment for GIDC and conversion therapy are called out, specifically for being unethical, and that the APA recommends that ethical practitioners refrain from attempts to change individuals' sexual orientation, keeping in mind the medical dictum to first, do no harm. The authors note the similarity between trying to change a person's orientation and their gender identity, particularly at a young age. They wrap up by saying that clinicians should support the parents' acceptance and love for their child as they grow up, regardless of future sexual orientation and gender identification. Zucker disagrees with many of the criticisms and calls attention to his gender identity researcher street cred. He disagrees that gender and GID is a social construct, in part through some pedantry. With regard to the different referral rate between AMAB and AFAB youth, he brings in the different diagnosis rate in pervasive developmental disorder, now included in the DSM-5 as autism, asking if the critical authors would call autism a social construct. Okay, but there's mounting evidence that autism may be underdiagnosed in girls and women, and the argument that the world is basically built for neurotypical people, so the behaviors and thought patterns associated with autism would by definition be seen as disordered. So it's not quite the same thing as saying gender is a social construct, but nice try. In an argument that seems to go against his general claim, Zucker notes that AFAB kids may have to display a higher threshold of cross-gender behavior to be referred for treatment than boys because of the relative social acceptability. As such, AFAB youth below that threshold may not be referred for treatment, which could result in greater experienced distress. Zucker's response to the changes in how the diagnostic criteria are applied to AFAB and AMAB youth, in part, is to defend or explain his positions and recommendations over time. He then goes on the offensive, attacking the title of the original paper, seeming to miss the point of the title itself. Zucker agrees that the research is lacking on reliability, but disagrees about the validity of the GIDC diagnosis. He argues that the end state of GID, meaning hormonal treatment and specific surgical operations, means it is difficult to argue that cross-gender feelings and behaviors simply constitute normative variation or do not constitute an example of impairment. The required physical interventions are simply too radical to be thought about otherwise. It seems to me that even in cultures where there is apparently considerable tolerance for transgendered individuals, there still must be in the person distress regarding the disjunction between somatic sex and felt psychological gender. Otherwise, why would an individual choose to live in a cross-gendered role? Maybe because it's something intrinsic to the person, and they're trying to get their external sense of self to match up with the internal? And I get that we're almost sort of agreeing on that last part with the in the person distress, but it appears to be a normal part of human experience. And if the trans or non-binary person is given the opportunity to get the pieces to match, the impairment typically goes away. This could lead to a rabbit hole discussion of what exactly it means for a person to have deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional behavior. Like, if the cultural circumstances were different, bipolar might be seen in the normal range of things. But I've already sidetracked us far enough with the discussion of these two papers, so we'll just leave it at the current understanding of things. A trans identity is not considered disordered. Gender dysphoria is because of the distress felt by the person experiencing it and the potential impacts it has on their functioning. Zucker says that children with GID seem to have more trouble than other children with basic cognitive concepts concerning their gender, such as misclassifying their gender. What do you think the odds are that this misclassifying happens to correspond with what the child identifies as instead of what they were assigned at birth? His final comment about the reliability and validity concerns are that GID is consistent with the DSM's conceptualization of distress and impairment, unless one wants to argue that the desire to change sex is simply a variation of normal gender development. Yeah? The only path of gender development? No. But one of the paths, certainly. Zucker argues against the social construction of gender appropriateness, saying that in patriarchal cultures, AMAB youth shouldn't want to join the oppressed female class, then refers back to the difference in referral rates. But then he says the GID is tied to the culture the person is in because the person diagnosed with GID tends to go to the cultural gender roles, then adds that the critical author's cultural analysis is incomplete. He doesn't address the use of parental self-report or really tackle most of the discussion on the validity of the GIDC diagnosis. Zucker disagrees with the argument that GID and GIDC were added to the DSM as a way to keep same-sex attraction in there, instead arguing that it was only added when there was sufficient clinical data available to describe the phenomenon, to propose diagnostic criteria, and so on. So he doesn't really directly respond to their criticism there either. Zucker's next section has a strange title. Is the diagnosis and treatment of GID in children iatrogenic? I call this strange because I don't think the other authors were ever making the case that doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, whoever, were putting the disorder in children, as would be suggested by iatrogenic. Zucker seems to miss what the critical authors were arguing about with regard to the potentially stigmatizing effect of being diagnosed with GIDC, as he says that the negative peer interactions are a consequence of the way kids diagnosed with GIDC are acting. It seemed to me that the issue of GIDC being potentially stigmatizing was about a central part of these youth's identity being pathologized, not about how they were being treated by other children. Zucker's response to the criticism of treatment is where the race analogy comes into play. He says that treatment for ethnic identity disorder should be to address the underlying factors that have led the child to believe that his life would be better as a white person, not to support their wish to be white. Interestingly, and depressingly, Zucker puts forward an argument that is practically repeated in Shrier's book. Many have argued that GID in children is a result, at least in part, of psychodynamic and psychosocial mechanisms, which lead to an analogous fantasy solution, that becoming a member of the other sex would somehow resolve internalized distress. He then says the other authors should respond with how they would take this stance to be incorrect, as he predicts they would disagree with this view. Anytime you bring psychodynamic explanations into the discussion, the argument loses credibility in my book. While Zucker is saying that these other authors need to argue against this psychosocial or psychodynamic mechanism, Zucker himself needs to explicate why a black child in the height of the civil rights movement, possibly wanting to be white, is coming from the same psychological place as a child identifying as trans in the early aughts. But there is a telling piece of info on Zucker's approach. Zucker says that it is as legitimate to want to make youngsters comfortable with their gender identity to make it correspond to the physical reality of their biological sex as it is to make youngsters comfortable with their ethnic identity, to make it correspond to the physical reality of the color of their skin. Zucker has disagreed with the assessment that the work done in his gender clinic was conversion therapy, but that make it there, in that context, really suggests that that is a fair representation of the treatment goals, to get the gender questioning kids to just stop questioning their gender. And just, wow. Who knew you could buy cans of worms in bulk? Zucker argues that the best course of action is to start a gender questioning youth through psychological treatment, and, if they persist, then to move on to hormonal or surgical options. The nature of these psychological treatments is not detailed in this article. The supporting reference is to a 2001 book chapter I can't get access to in time. But again, referring back to his former gender clinic, we can probably hazard a guess, especially with what's been said in this article. This section ends with a comment about Michael Jackson's changing appearance as indicative of the narrowing plasticity in adulthood. That's Zucker. Classy guy. Zucker's next section tackles if GIDC treatment is similar to conversion therapy for same-gender attraction. He says the comparison is flawed because it confounds the timing of intervention, going on to talk about how orientation tends to be stable in adulthood, so it would be better to compare the stability of GID in adulthood. Talk about a non-answer. So he does say that this has been addressed at length elsewhere and provides a reference dump of where it's been talked about, but this paper is supposed to be a response paper to that other paper. Respond to that paper, especially for something as big and important as conversion therapy. He wraps up by saying that he hopes this will spark further discussions and debate. So the Zucker paper seems to have supplied Shrier with the black kid wanting to be white analogy, but this paper is coming from somebody whose gender clinic was shut down when Ontario banned conversion therapy, so take from it what you will. Okay, back to Shrier's continuation of this hypothetical black child. Shrier tries to fit this example of the child identifying as white into the gender-affirming care framework you might see with a therapist, using their name, offering to help educate the parents, advice on how to buy skin bleach. Look, I know that I'm on the other side of this ideological divide and Zucker is on Shrier's side, but skin bleach is not the same thing as a binder. Shrier drives this analogy into the ground, and then keeps going, detailing how the therapists who affirm their white identity wouldn't be seen by others as compassionate, that the sorts of things this child saw as flaws were tied up in stereotypes, and that the therapist should challenge the child's, quote, self-destructive intentions, end quote, in changing their appearance, They should be happy with what they were born as, and they aren't alone in not fully meeting the stereotypes assigned to their race.
We would expect compassion from any therapist who works with adolescents. We would demand that they listen. We would hope that the therapists achieve understanding, but we would never want them to automatically agree with the patient's self-diagnosis, both because that is so likely to strengthen the patient's flawed self-perception, and because agreeing with the patient's self-assessment has never been a mental health expert's job. In fact, it still isn't the mental health professional's job with regard to any other psychiatric condition.
I doubt that any therapist who works with gender-questioning youth is automatically agreeing with their clients. There's probably a back and forth discussion where they talk about what feelings the client has, why they think they feel that way, how long they've been feeling that way, and just because a therapist may ultimately agree with the self-diagnosis doesn't mean that they didn't put some thought behind that decision. The 5 in the quote isn't to a reference. It's instead to a comment that people with body integrity identity disorder seek a similar form of treatment to people with gender dysmorphia. She would make this comparison in this way. Briefly, body integrity identity disorder is a condition where a person has an intense drive to remove a limb, become paralyzed, or physically disabled in some way. The primary motivation appears to be a need to feel complete or correct in their body. The way it exists prior to modification doesn't match with how they feel it should be, and there is a great deal of distress felt in the current state of their body. Medication and therapy don't seem to lessen the distress experienced by people with BIID. Only making the desired modifications can ease that distress. The ethics of removing a functional part of somebody's body is understandably a medical gray area for doctors. But it has been argued that as long as the person making the request is capable of consenting to the surgery, surgeons should be able to carry out the request. Especially when sensory processing or somatosensory abnormalities for the affected body part are taken into account. So, yes, Shrier? People with gender dysphoria are sort of seeking something similar from healthcare practitioners as people with BIID. Sort of. Broad strokes. There is a mismatch between how they feel their body should be and how it is. But this misses the part where, in both cases, effective treatment is to help the person get the body that they want. So the statement that agreeing with the patient's self-assessment has never been a mental health expert's job is wrong by virtue of missing the point of their job, which is to help people with things they need help on, not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with them, and what is the most ethical treatment for different situations. Despite Shrier's assertions that agreeing with self-diagnosis isn't part of their job, she says that doctors and psychologists use gender-affirming care in their treatment of trans people. Further, she says that the APA guidelines were made political by talking about anything other than gender dysphoria. You know, like the people who may or may not be experiencing gender dysphoria. How dare the APA issue professional guidelines on how to treat people? Shrier says she spoke to many gender specialist psychotherapists in the course of writing this book, and the one she focused on, at least interview-wise in this book, is Dr. Randy Kaufman. And before we get to that focus, Shrier did throw in that many of these gender therapists she spoke to said it was not their job to question an adolescent patient's stated gender identity, but instead to facilitate the patient's range of options. Sounds reasonable. Helping teens feel out their options hardly seems like they're being shoved down the trans path. Shrier does not provide an opinion on this statement. Kaufman is an expert in gender identity and expression, with a history going through Boston's Children's Hospital to New York's Ackerman Institute for Family.
So what does Randy Kaufman believe transgender-identified teenagers...
So, it was pointed out to me that Shrier's trans-identified teenager and trans-identified adolescent follows a familiar pattern to what trans-exclusionary radical feminists call trans people. So, if you're familiar with this already, I'm sorry. If you aren't, the turfy jargon acronyms for trans people are TIMS and TIFs. So, trans-identified male or trans-identified female. Coincidence? Methinks not.
need from their parents and therapists. Well, What I would say is that there are certain things that transgender and non-binary adolescents really need for good mental health. And I'd say the single most important factor is to start with family support and acceptance, Dr. Kaufman said. There are studies that show that adolescent children who are supported by their family, the suicide rate drops dramatically and mental health increases, and that gets borne out over time.
So something that needs to be emphasized here before we get lost in the trees is that parental support is important for teens, especially if they're going through something big in their life. And yeah, the framing of this advice is in the protective nature against suicide risk, but it's also important for their general well-being. I'm not finding anything by Kaufman regarding her opinion of this interview. It's possible that Shrier was more faithful to what was said in the interview than what Chase Ross described happening in his. But given the tone of Kaufman's answers, I would be surprised if she knew the title or central thesis of this book when being interviewed by Shrier. Let's see what Shrier does with this info, that family support is important for these teens. Given the mantras covered in the previous video, it'll probably not be a surprise that Shrier focuses in on the link between familial support and a lower suicide risk. She says this is a reason used by therapists to encourage parents to support the gender transition process, up through medical transition. Further, Shrier indicates that the therapists say that this support is the least the family can do. It isn't clear where this medical transition under threat of averting suicide portion is coming from. This seems to be a link Shrier's making that's not explicitly intended, at least in Kaufman's interview. I would think a reasonable reaction to this information would be that support is mentioned as a preventative, protective measure, especially if the parents are worried about the suicide risk, not as a manipulation tactic. If another therapist said this, it's not indicated. It isn't clear to me if Shrier's trying to not pull Kaufman's interview out of context and just focus on the bits that are relevant and kind of just ignore the rest, or if she's just not hearing everything that's being said to her.
Part of the acceptance means now understanding that this child is going through a gender journey, whatever it may look like. And you know, many kids and adolescents do transition, but not everyone does, Dr. Kaufman told me. And transition can look different for different people. Some people do social transition only, some people do social and medical transition, some people do surgical, not medical. So it really varies what people choose to do or not do, but the most important thing is to recognize that someone who feels like they're not cisgender in whatever way they identify, they need to be supported and affirmed in that gender.
Repeating for emphasis. Many kids and adolescents do transition, but not everyone does. It really varies what people choose to do or not do. All Kaufman is asking the parents to do here, it seems, is be prepared to support their child on their gender journey, with the knowledge it could have many different forms. The important thing is to support them. But what does Shrier get out of this?
Asking your child, "Are you out of your mind?" is clearly off limits then.
Yes, Shrier, it is. Because that is the reaction of someone who is themselves out of their mind.
So is, "No, I will not call you Clive."
Yes, that is also off limits. Just because it's not the one you picked out for them doesn't mean it's not valid.
And, "We don't even eat hormone-raised beef, for God's sake."
You planning on eating your kid? What's the problem?
Put out of your mind every manner of very understandable parental interjection. You don't want your child to hang himself in the garage just because you accidentally referred to them as their birth name.
No, Shrier, these are not very understandable reactions to the news that your kid is trans or NB. This falls more on the batshit end of things. And of course, the closest she can bring herself to correctly gendering this hypothetical person is in air quotes. But we're the ones who are overreacting. Shrier says that Kaufman emphasized the importance of parents not just going through the motions of support, but actually believing their child in what they're experiencing, with the understanding that their identity or expression could change over time. Wonder if Shrier was always this pedantic, or if she got lessons from Zucker.
It's worth noting how different this is from being the parent of a gay adolescent. An adolescent who comes out as gay asks their parents to accept them for what they are. An adolescent who is transgender identified asks to be accepted for what they are not. Even the most loving parent might be forgiven for failing this mind-bending test.
Is test too hard for you, Shrier? Let me break it down for you. You failed this mind-bending test because you couldn't see the bigger concept behind the question. It's not that one circumstance is a positive and the other is a negative. Full credit would come from the understanding that these situations and many others can be framed in the affirmative way or in the negating way. A gay orientation can be framed as who they are attracted to or who they are not attracted to. And the awful thing is that gay kids to this day, coming out to their parents, can be met with bullshit like, why can't you just be straight? Which is framing it in who they aren't. What's next? Shrier wants to know how parents could support a social or medical modification if their child's gender expression or identity could change over time.
By adolescence, most adolescents have a pretty good sense of how to discern the differences between things like gender identity, gender role, and gender expression, which is how you express your gender with your dress, your hair, your mannerisms, your names, your pronouns, things like that, Dr. Kaufman assured me. It's pretty rare by adolescents for people to change their mind. But how rare is pretty rare? When you're contemplating injections that may permanently alter your child's facial features, enlarge their clitoris, leave them covered in body hair, and perhaps render them infertile, is the pretty rare chance that they might change their mind rare enough?
This is starting to seem like a gish gallop. I guess Shrier's in the same not trusting experts boat as the mom from the previous video, as she spent all that time laying out Kaufman's credentials, but then not asking her how rare is rare. Or even doing just a cursory Google search. The D, or in the case of this paper, re-transition rate after puberty is less than 3.8%. Not even a book page ago, Kaufman was talking about how transition can look for different people. So Shrier
leaping straight for the clitoris
seems to be an on-brand overreaction. And of course, there's the recurring worry about future fertility. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that youth seeking puberty blockers are worried about these permanent changes, just in a different way. And also that testosterone doesn't just come in a shot. Shrier says that this is the point in interviews where she gets told to slow down, without really saying how often that happened. Like if it was a one-off, it was frequent, if the questions were always in this order, and if this was the exact point, or it was just a general tendency, so details are thin. She says that the therapists indicate that this process is directed by the teen, and it's important to listen to them and what they're requesting.
Names and pronouns, the importance of them cannot be overemphasized, Dr. Kaufman told me. That is something that really shows support, and even if it's challenging for the parent to change names or pronouns, it's very important that they work at it. Why? I asked her, wondering if these poor parents hadn't already been troubled enough.
Multiple people have pointed out that Shrier near universally takes the parent's side of things. Seemed like a good time to note that observation. The poor parents and their suffering in this experience. Not what the kid's going through, the poor parents and the trouble that they're having.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the
Parents.
Imagine if someone started to call you by a male name and pronoun, she said. It wouldn't feel like it's you, and it would feel disrespectful, right? We don't really think about that. What if suddenly someone was calling you Andy instead of Abigail, and you'd be like, what's up with that? Try as it might, this notion had trouble working itself through the crusty loam of my cisgender brain. But wait, this is an adolescent we're talking about. They've been called, say, birth name their whole life. In what sense would this be a shock and trauma for their parents to continue to do what they'd always done? Use the name they'd given them? Refer to them as their AFAB child? It wasn't they who had changed the rules.
I understand this attempt at inducing empathy, at getting Shrier to think about what it would be like to be misgendered herself, but it seems like it never works. Maybe one of you has been able to induce an empathy epiphany in someone, but this, and intentionally misgendering people to try to force them to grow some perspective, just doesn't seem to work. I wish I had a tried and true method of getting people to understand why using somebody's dead name or gender is not okay, but I don't know one. And I'm not discounting the emotional process this is for parents. They have to change and adapt to everything too. But if they can't see it from their child's perspective, maybe they could at least take them at their word that using their birth name or gender is hurtful. That whole being supportive thing that has been a thread throughout Kaufman's interview. Shrier mentions a sense of testing Kaufman's patience in this interview. Kaufman tries to further explain, with parents who refuse to use the name other than the one they gave the child at birth, would demonstrate to the child that they don't respect or understand that child's identity. And she tries to use an example of an 8-year-old who identifies as trans, and the parents basically going, "Nuh-uh, we know better than you do." And then switches to ask why we trust kids, even at 8 years old, who identify with the gender that they were basically assigned at birth versus those who don't. Of course, Shrier goes weird with this.
We had landed somewhere new. Dr. Kaufman seemed to be introducing an ontology, one in which chromosomal DNA is no more determinative of identity than the ineffable feelings of an 8-year-old.
There she goes again with chromosomes, which appears to be a subset of the scientific markers of last video. Lots of things go into a person's personality, Shrier. Especially when we're talking at the level of chromosomes. It's not a simple 1-to-1 2-box choice. As we talked about in the second video, the box checked by doctors at birth is based on a visual examination of the visible baby bits, and that gender identity doesn't always match up with whatever box was checked at that time. And Kaufman apparently tried to emphasize to Shrier that it's normal to have some variability in how well we feel that box represents us. It's a pity Kaufman isn't making the talk circuit rounds instead of Shrier.
But wouldn't all the variation and inconstancy of a gender journey seem to provide reason to keep calling your kid what you always have? No, gender therapists will tell you, because adolescents know who they are, even if they later change their minds. I think the most important thing to know about gender is that for some people, it's really fluid and it can remain fluid throughout life, Dr. Kaufman told me.
Kaufman wasn't saying that the variation would occur in any given person. Come on. That seems more tied to the variability between people and how well their assigned sex matches their gender. With regard to a person's gender identity or expression not being fixed, oh no? I'd bet that for the majority of cases, a parent would have to learn one new name. One. The potential fluidity is no reason to not honor your kid's requests. The thing with fluidity is it can be fluid for cis people too, and we just don't really think about it. I don't know how many times I've heard a new or expecting mom say that the process of having a kid made them feel more feminine, and I've heard new dads talk about how it makes them feel more masculine. Kaufman continues on to say that if society becomes more comfortable with fluid genders that aren't restricted to the historical binary, she'd predict that more people would live a gender-fluid life, and it's something that they would want to do. Shrier quotes Tennyson to throw a pity party for the parents who are being asked to be supportive of their gender questioning or non-conforming kids. Don't forget, dear viewer, that in the stories Shrier has shared, the parents have seemed to be anything but the victim. Then, in a move Lobster Daddy himself would likely approve.
But what about all those parents who can't get these ideas through their thick skulls? What about, say, Christian or Muslims or Jews who insist on a gender binary merely because people have done so for thousands of years?
We also bled people for all sorts of ailments for thousands of years. Want to keep doing that too?
I tell them that we can't change the mind, and so we have to change the body, Dr. Kaufman said. That's sort of the nutshell. I would let them know that if someone identifies this way, it's pretty rare that they would change their mind. We have known that we can't socialize someone into or out of a gender.
Shrier says that Kaufman followed that by relating it to a child coming out as gay, and noting that conversion therapy doesn't work for either case. And so Kaufman tries to get parents to understand that their support and acceptance is critical for their child's well-being, and lists off some consequences if they aren't.
It's a gun to the head. Do as your kid says, or they might just take their own life. Again and again, I heard this question from gender therapists and also from parents to whom they had spoken. Would you rather a dead daughter or a live son?
For some reason, I have a hard time believing that question would be used on anyone except the most obstinate of parents. It's probably no coincidence that Shrier heard this question as often as she did. You push the anti-trans questions far enough, and this does become the bottom line question. And to talk this back from the edge a bit, this doesn't have to be about the risk of suicide. Despite Shrier's insistence, that's all it boils down to. This is also about whether you're going to have contact with your child in the future. How many stories has she shared where the unsupportive parents were cut out of their child's lives because they were denying their child was trans, or trying to block gender-affirming care or treatment? So the question then becomes, would you rather contact with your child in the future or not? In this section, Shrier outlines what she considers to be the key claims of the gender-affirming therapeutic philosophy, saying, a great many irreversible medical outcomes depend on it being a good theory. Think we can expect some hard-hitting scientific rigor here, or more of the same? 1. Adolescents know who they are.
For those of you who have ever been an adolescent or attempted the toe-curling, hair-whitening endeavor of raising one, hold your laughter. Resist the urge to squeal out loud at the preposterous notion that a teenager in any sense knows who they are with the level of certainty sufficient to entrust them with life-altering decisions.
More of the same it is. Surprise! This has been lingering in the background for a bit, but it's the first time Shrier's been so blatant about it. So, let's talk adultism. The idea behind adultism is that adults can think or act about youth in a biased way because of the latter's age, in part because of the disparity in power. As detailed in the 1978 paper, this can be a harmful issue in that it can result in kids being treated as inferior to adults, in Shrier's case, cognitively inferior. Because of their perceived inferior cognitive status, adults may act overprotective or possessive of the kids. Related to that, adults may insist that children grow up the way the parent wants, instead of letting the child be themselves. And adults insisting that children do things or think in certain ways. We talked about this in the parenting chapter 12 Rules, and a quote I pulled out there from this paper is incredibly relevant here. It is adultist when adults use their extra power to mold a child with whom they come into contact in their own image. Such adults may use their extra power to hide from themselves the fact that they may be too full of their own importance and too self-righteous. This has been explored further, and it seems that the negative preconceptions or behaviors people have towards different groups interact in a way to lead to even more negative behaviors or thoughts about people who have joint membership of those groups. In this case, being young, AFAB, and trans may interact to produce more adultism-y behaviors, as is the case for older LGBTQ adults with ageism. Shrier insisting that it is absurd that a youth could know anything about themselves smacks of adultism.
Exponents of gender affirmation often argue that, unlike childhood gender dysphoria, which shows very high rates of desistance when no affirmation or transition is made, adolescent dysphoria has higher rates of persistence into adulthood. It's hard to evaluate this claim since there is no long-term study to prove it. Those studies that exist are based largely on samples of adolescents whose onset of gender dysphoria began in early childhood.
Wasn't she, or maybe it was Littman, arguing earlier that child-onset gender dysphoria was more legit than when it starts as a teen? Reference 9 is quite possibly the 100% of teens who start puberty blockers go on to hormonal treatment paper from the last video. This work from the Netherlands compared a handful of psychological measures between the time when a youth attended a gender identity clinic, time 0, and before starting cross-sex hormones, or CSH for short in the paper, time 1. They found that some measures, like general emotional problems or depressive symptoms, decreased, general functioning increased, but anxiety and anger levels did not change, nor did gender dysphoria or body satisfaction. I want to point out that the teens were asked directly in this survey. They weren't solely relying on parental reports for things. And as noted in the abstract, the teens tracked in the study did not withdraw from the puberty blockers, and all started CSH. Confusingly for where Shrier has this reference, the paper indicates that at the Amsterdam Gender Identity Clinic, adolescents are eligible for puberty suppression when they are diagnosed with GID, have shown persistent gender dysphoria since childhood, live in a supportive environment, and have no serious comorbid psychiatric disorders that may interfere with the diagnostic assessment. To be eligible for treatment, they have to have been experiencing this since a young age, not just adolescence. So her first claim doesn't really make sense. Researchers are working on the second claim, so that's a wash. Reference 10 comes from researchers at Finnish or Swedish universities. I bring that up because while on some fronts, like being able to bureaucratically transition, they seem to be more progressive if you don't look too close. but in the details it gets a bit hairy. In Finland, being able to legally transition requires sterilization, although maybe this will change in the near future. In Sweden, legally transitioning used to require being a citizen of legal age, unmarried, living the transgender life for 2 years, sterilization, and having already had gender-affirming surgery. This was gradually updated to removing the sterilization and surgery requirements, with further changes pending. I bring this up because it might help contextualize the tone of the paper. This paper basically questions if medical treatment, meaning puberty blockers, hormonal, or surgical treatment, is appropriate for trans youth. It also brings up rapid onset gender dysphoria in a manner similar to what we've seen so far in this book and Littman's paper. Frustratingly, this paper may be where Shrier is getting the desistance figure from, not reference 9. Let's follow this reference rabbit hole a little to see if Shrier's high rates of desistance when no affirmation or transition is made can be found. One paper interviewed teenagers, average age roughly 16, who were previously referred to the Gender Identity Clinic at Amsterdam's VU University Medical Center. They had initially been assessed around the age of 9. Keeping this somewhat on task, this paper doesn't seem to indicate that teens who stopped identifying as trans had not been given gender-affirming treatment or taken steps in socially transitioning. If anything, the opposite is true, as several indicate discomfort, embarrassment, or shame in having to undo what steps they had taken or having had this experience in their past. And before, this is proof it's harmful to let kids transition. These stories highlight the importance of education and normalization of the different gender journeys people can take. Maybe if that was more understood, these kids wouldn't have these negative experiences because it's just part of feeling out your gender. The other reference I want to touch on is a letter to the editor, suggesting that desistance is potentially not as clear-cut as thought. The authors note that some youth who stopped seeking treatment at the gender clinic would later return as adults for further treatment. It's described that they tried out different gender identities and sexual orientations before returning to pursue transition treatment, indicating that for some people, this truly is a gender journey that took some time for them to figure out. The authors argue that more research with greater tracking of those who leave gender treatment programs is needed to better aid everyone questioning their gender. Back to Shrier's quote. Finally, even using reference 10 as a springboard for other research, I'm not finding this very high rates of desistance when no affirmation or transition is made claim. Who is arguing these things, Shrier? Kaufman? Someone else? Who? If Shrier's book is any indication, even the people she's talking about and has included the parental stories of started at least questioning their gender when young. It was just not seen as such by the parents. And this isn't to say that someone can't get hit by gender dysphoria or start identifying as trans or non-binary around the time adolescence starts. That's when the puberty train starts to leave the station, and somewhat nebulous feelings could coalesce into something real and identifiable at that point. But I keep interrupting, Shrier. I apologize. Please continue. Shrier refers back to reference 9, the one about kids who go on puberty blockers, later going on to hormonal treatments.
Of course, that does not prove that these adolescents knew who they were. At most, it proves that if you medically halt a kid's puberty so that they do not obtain secondary sex characteristics, while also socially affirming their new gender identity, that adolescent will be less likely to later reverse course.
Her causality is all wrong. It's not that the puberty blockers are causing the later hormonal treatments. There's a mediating factor there, the youth's gender identity. On top of that, her assertions haven't been backed by her research. And on top of all of that, we know of too many instances where this is patently untrue. David Reimer is quite possibly the most famous example. Because of a poorly done circumcision, the decision was made to raise David as a girl. This included reconstructive surgery and hormonal treatment to further that end. But David didn't feel right in his body and became suicidally depressed as a teen, at which point his parents came clean about what had happened to him. After that, David started living as a teenage boy and had surgeries to undo what had been done. The full story is much more depressing, so we'll leave it there. Yes, some of Shrier's research does indicate discomfort for the teens who stopped identifying as trans, but they still detransitioned. They were affirmed in the trans identity, but they still reversed course. This does indicate that these kids know who they are, or at least are on the path towards figuring it out. Final comment here. We don't prove things in science land. We run bunches of experiments with results that either support a theory, model, framework, whatever, or doesn't support it, so sort of disconfirms. And we do enough experiments and the evidence accumulates one way or another. And if we have a bunch of things confirming this theory, hypothesis, whatever, we generally regard this as probably what it is, but it isn't proven to be that thing. And this nature of how we do science is something that young Earth creationists or climate change denialists are all too happy to take advantage of. As we don't prove things, that means science doesn't know what it's doing. Shrier refers to Erik Erikson's developmental model to say that teens are still figuring themselves out, so why should we believe they have their gender identity sorted? She further argues that many body modifications, ranging from tattoos to plastic surgery, are done with the belief that it will make us happier, but may be regretted down the road. Then she says that teenagers are bad at avoiding risky behaviors, particularly if their friends approve of said behavior, and this is in part blamed on the delayed maturation of the prefrontal cortex. Reference 12 is an attributional mess. Mounts appears to be the one to have written the Psychology Today post, but Shrier gives credit to Magliano instead. Also, the first reference in the blog post is the second half of Schrier's reference. The blog post is mostly talking about why teens may engage in riskier behaviors than adults, and some things parents can do to manage those risks. The emphasis here is on the teen's friend group. The paper takes a social neurodevelopmental approach to explain the changes in risky behavior across the early part of the lifespan, mostly focusing on changes in neurotransmitter pathways. So reference 12 is getting a pass, albeit with some notes about the proper attribution of authorship. Reference 13 is the Psychology Today blog post from reference 12, so moving on. Reference 14 is a review paper that tries to tie together what's known about the brain's development around the legal benchmarks of being considered an adult, and how it can or should be used in deciding public policy. It does mention the maturation process of the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex, but the emphasis of the paper is on how we don't really have a way to measure somebody's adultness by looking at their brain. Caution is urged for non-scientists trying to run stories off of published papers, as they may misrepresent the findings or the research. So yeah, reference 14 does talk about the brain development stuff, but it's amusingly couched in a warning to not liberally draw conclusions where there is little empirical basis for interpreting the results. To bring this back to what Shrier was talking about, kids be doing risky shit sometimes. That doesn't mean that's why they're identifying as trans or non-binary. Shrier then asks if non-risky teens could be trusted with these sorts of decisions, using herself as an example. In college. Basically, she describes herself as a book nerd. In college, she didn't care much for her assets, so wanted to get a breast reduction. Her parents said no way, especially because it might damage her ability to breastfeed someday. She said there was no chance of that happening in the future, but without her parents' support, she couldn't afford to do it, so that was the end of it. 10 years passed, and she's having babies, and breastfeeding is a key part of the early experience for her.
I offer this personal story as a reminder of how imperfect our knowledge of our future desires is, how cavalier adolescents often are with risks they are in no position to assess, especially when faced with the encouragement of friends. This is not a reason to prescribe all identity alterations or body modifications for teenagers. It is merely cause for hesitation. A reason to be skeptical of the idea that teenagers' self-diagnosis should be automatically accepted, especially when the terminus of that new identity involves dangerous surgeries.
But what if her parents had said okay? What if she had had the procedure and things turned out hunky-dory? Just because things turned out this way doesn't mean that the decision to have the surgery would have been regretted, if that was the path she was living. Our knowledge of what we want down the road may be imperfect, but we're generally pretty adaptable to the life choices we make. But I'm going to note this repeated idea that the youth at this book's focus are making the choice to identify as trans in a cavalier fashion. For some, it may be, but that doesn't mean that's true for everyone. And this reiteration of the irreversible damage caused by pursuing transition. Clearly, Shrier wasn't really listening to Kaufman. Shrier promises that a later chapter will have plenty of proof of the harm of mistakenly transitioning, which she argues means that teens shouldn't be encouraged to make any significant life changes themselves. For some things, it going poorly for the minority means the majority should probably avoid it, like ingesting radium or uranium. Generally not a good health move. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about teens who have come out as trans or non-binary and are seeking gender-affirming care. Overall, the research generally indicates positive outcomes for gender-affirming treatment, which is why it's the recommendation of health and psychological organizations. Some people may detransition, and that's okay. They need to be supported too. But there has to be some middle ground where we try to figure out why some people detransition, so maybe we can prevent that in the future, while at the same time allowing youth who want to pursue transition to get the gender-affirming care that they want. This claim ends with Shrier saying that gender identity and expression should be explored in therapy, but in a way that doesn't harden the youth's beliefs by being too affirming. Natch. Final ruling. Adolescents have real feelings and know themselves best. Claim 2. Social transition and affirmation is a no-lose proposition. This came up in Shrier's conversation with Kaufman, and Kaufman indicated,
generally, it's a lot more harmful to a child to not go with a transition in the first place, even if they transition back, than it is to wait and say, no, you can't make this decision, you're not old enough, or you don't know your own mind. Those can be very damaging things for children and adolescents. Faced with this dire prognosis, many parents understandably give in. Any parent who has ever refused an adolescent knows how much strength such stands require. The most persistent street hustlers have nothing on the average teen faced with something they want.
Identifying as trans or non-binary is not the same thing as wanting to dye your hair, wanting to go to a certain party, or other teenager-y demands. It's on a whole other level, and I'm kind of disgusted that Shrier doesn't seem to make the distinction there. The gendered language gets pretty heavy for a bit, so for the sake of keeping things understandable, we're going to assume that she's talking about a trans boy. So, sorry NBs. Love ya.
Commence the rewriting of history. Your child is not only a boy, they somehow always were. So fine, call Grandma and tell her birth name is now Jorge. Let them use the boys' bathrooms and play on the boys' teams. The therapist said it was riskier not to, and if they later change their mind, no harm, no foul? That's gender therapists' claim, that social transitioning can always be readily and harmlessly undone.
Shrier said she's cool with adult trans people, but that seems to be a dubious claim at this point, given how the book is shaping up. She really can't understand the potential harm looming over these kids, can she? In things from Kaufman I didn't include, the closest I see to her saying detransitioning would be readily and harmlessly undone is when she said there's nothing to lose in letting kids transition. She said that if a kid needs to detransition, then that's what needs to happen for them, to whatever identity and expression they're comfortable with. She didn't say it would be super harmful, but she also didn't say it would be without its own journey.
Is this right? The truth is that our identities are socially negotiated, said Lisa Marchiano, Jungian analyst and an outspoken critic of gender-affirmative therapy.
No real references, and another Junging. Super. Much convinced. Wow. Ready for some mental gymnastics?
It's a heck of a point. Social transition, by definition, is a communal activity requiring the buy-in of others. It insists on the community's participation in this new identity. It requires that others accede to certain practices, if not entirely adopt the belief themselves. And it may even increase an adolescent's dissatisfaction with their body. Once you've cemented their belief that they really are, or are supposed to be, actually a boy, their given body can only be an endless source of disappointment to them.
It's like she's almost saying that gender is a social construct. Like, she's got it from a different angle, but then she takes it to her weird, dark place again. A separate work of Shrier's, this time fiction, involved her doing a lot of research into the Holocaust and interviewing survivors. And in her opinion, some of the deepest psychological scars came from living under an assumed identity and name. She describes one woman who, in the middle of everything, was taken in by a Catholic family and took on an identity to match. and afterwards felt like she couldn't fully integrate with Jewish culture again. Shrier notes that this woman hadn't chosen her new identity, like trans boys do, but she had been able to erase who she had been. And this thought continues with Shrier talking about how our social environment can influence how we view ourselves.
All of which is to suggest that social transition is not nothing. It is, in fact, an extremely potent and consequential act. It provides what world-renowned gender psychologist Kenneth Zucker, no fan of affirmative therapy, called an experiment of nurture when he spoke to me. It places a child or adolescent in an environment in which the entire school is asked to participate in affirming this child's identity as the opposite sex. If the adolescent wasn't entirely convinced of their new identity before the experiment, they may be much more so after it's underway.
Who suggested that social transitioning was nothing? If anything, Kaufman's emphasis on the parents being supportive every step of the way would suggest that this early step in transitioning is important. Also, how is this an experiment of nurture? Although, I guess prior to recent history, it could almost be said we were running a naturalistic study on the nature side of things, seeing as how trans or non-binary people were not really spoken about or acknowledged. Or maybe that would also be demonstrative of nurture, just in the not affirming way? But even in those conditions, trans people risk their safety to be able to live true to themselves. I'm calling bullshit. Trying to turn gender-affirming treatment of students into a bad thing is disgusting. Shrier goes on to talk about a paper we encountered in the research rabbit hole earlier concerning the kids who had been referred to the Amsterdam Gender Clinic. She emphasizes the difficulties faced by detransitioning AFAB youth, as we already touched on. This reference also contains an apparently anonymous Fourth Wave Now blog post arguing against social transition. Moving on. This is elaborated on by the Jungian analyst, who says that people want to save face and not look like an idiot. Finally, Shrier asks if a gender-affirming therapist can be objective enough to do no harm to their client and pull apart the nature of the ailment the client is seeking help for, given the potential risk. Why did she bother speaking to Kaufman? Final ruling. There is insufficient evidence presented that there are high costs associated with social transition and affirmative care. Claim stands. Claim 3. If you don't affirm, your child may kill themselves. This claim made Shrier think of a short story in the back of Goodbye Columbus. This story involves a Jewish boy preparing for his bar mitzvah and asking hard theological questions of his rabbi. In particular, how is the rabbi sure that Jesus isn't the Son of God? And the rabbi doesn't really have a satisfactory answer, but the kid keeps pushing and pushing, and eventually the rabbi smacks him. So the kid goes on top of the building and threatens to jump unless everybody who's there drops to their knees and prays to Jesus. And given that he's threatening to jump, they all do so, and the kid jumps anyways, but is saved by a safety net. Shrier sees two sides to the story. One is this kid's real bar mitzvah, as he exposed the hypocrisy in the adult's belief. The other is in how easy it is for kids to manipulate the adults around them by threatening to hurt themselves. Okay, but there's a bit of a logical catch here. There's the research behind parental support being protective against a trans youth potentially ending their life, which could be framed as an ultimate form of self-harm. Then there's Shrier's assertion that gender confirmation treatments are a form of self-harm. Assuming Shrier's assertion was true, which it isn't, but for concerned parents agreeing with this book, it would be treated as such, doesn't that leave them with two forms of potential self-harm, one of which isn't fatal?
Given the power this has to disarm and disable parental judgment, there is something a little disturbing about the fact that so many therapists feel comfortable trotting it out. There is, after all, no other life decision a teenager might make, no other identity proclamation, that would likely lead a therapist to blithely suggest to parents that if they don't go along with it, they might have a dead kid on their hands. It's a weapon so highly coercive, one would think a mental health expert would only brandish it, if ever, in a grave emergency.
From the stories and interviews shared in this book, it seems like this would be a last resort option used by therapists for parents who aren't being supportive of their trans youth. And given the elevated risk of suicide in the trans youth population, especially when they're not supported at home, this is a grave fucking emergency. Shrier moves on to question the veracity of the suicide statistics. She starts by saying that many mental health problems, including suicidal ideation, are high in the trans youth population. Her explicit references are to a review paper that found elevated levels of psychiatric disorders, including suicide attempts, in trans adults compared to cis adults that improve following gender-affirming treatment. And a study that found trans youth seeking gender treatment in Amsterdam had similar rates of comorbid disorders as kids seeking ADHD treatment. They also directly argued against the theory of Zucker's that gender identity disorder could be induced through high anxiety levels, as they didn't find elevated anxiety levels in most of their GID patients. Shrier talks about, but does not directly reference, something from the Williams Institute in 2014 that put the suicide risk in trans and gender nonconforming adults at 41%, and more on that in a second.
There are a few problems with the study, however. One is that it is entirely based on self-report. As a writer at Fourth Wave Now, a consortium of parents who oppose medical transition for young people pointed out in an excellent blog post, more careful and rigorous studies always follow up with in-person interviews, and when self-harming behaviors, not intended to end life, are controlled for, the actual suicide rate is typically halved, meaning the suicide attempt rate could be as low as 20%.
Shrier admits horror at the still high 20% figure, and says that trans youth are, quote, a deeply troubled population and suffering acutely. Reference 17 is for a Fourth Wave Now post, once again with no author attribution. On the bright side, the post linked to the 2014 survey report, so we can talk about that. The Williams Institute is attached to UCLA's law school and focuses on LGBT topics relevant to public policy and the law. The 41% suicide attempt rate is what they reported, but this was a self-report survey, so there's some things to keep in mind. It's unclear how representative the people who took the survey are of the general trans population. There may be some difference between people who were willing to take the survey versus those who weren't willing to or weren't aware of the survey in the first place. By the nature of what they're asking about, the survey can only talk about suicide attempts, as those who did more than attempt would be unable to respond. As the authors note, it's possible that the risk estimate was elevated because they didn't have separate questions specifically about self-harm. They also note that the survey doesn't control for many things that could influence suicidality, like negative life experiences or comorbid psychiatric disorders. I'm not sure why Shrier is choosing to discuss the results of the 2014 survey as opposed to the other things she cited, other than maybe this being the low-hanging data fruit of the bunch. It is worth noting, however, that the suicide risk is for adults. The article about children did not discuss suicide. Oh, now we have a problem with self-report? Convenient.
In order to justify the peculiar mandate that therapists immediately accept patients' self-diagnosis when presented with someone claiming gender dysphoria, we must answer two questions. One, is the gender dysphoria causing the suicidal ideation? And two, do we have any evidence that affirmation ameliorates mental health problems? The answer to both questions, it seems, is no.
We'll talk about her support for the categorical no in a second. This book is a peculiar mandate. Besides the guidelines from the APA and how to respectfully engage with trans people, I'm not seeing where she's getting this mandate from. Even in the APA guidelines, it talks about the affirming approach and, basically, Zucker's embracing their given body approach. It doesn't say to blindly jump on board with whatever the client says. But I guess to Shrier, not immediately shooting down gender dysphoria because the person came in thinking they might have it is not acceptable. It seems like Shrier is falling into a statistical trap with how she's setting up this problem. For one, yes, correlation does not equal causation. A correlation between gender dysphoria and suicidal thoughts does not tell us anything about which way the causality is going. The same issue potentially exists for her second question. For two, these questions are excluding the potential impact of factors other than what she's included. In the first question, there are likely other factors in play, like external support, treatment by others, and so forth, that could impact the relationship between dysphoria and ideation. The second question could get around this by doing a controlled experiment, where a group of trans youth are randomly assigned into groups receiving gender-affirming, Zucker, or a null treatment, which would probably just be general therapy, and looking at the change in mental health status. But generally, why is this issue being boiled down to these two questions? This is taking what looks like the last-ditch approach that therapists have in trying to convince parents to support their trans kids and blowing it beyond the scope of that argument. A therapist telling parents your support may help reduce your child's risk of suicide isn't also telling the parents that their support will somehow fix other psychological disorders their child might have. Shrier's support for her no answer to the two questions she posed. A recent academic study by Zucker, missing any other info to be able to pinpoint the paper, that supposedly found equivalent mental health outcomes for teens with or without gender dysphoria. A recent academic study does not a proper citation make. Evidence inadmissible. Next. Shrier says maybe it would still be worth affirming these youth if it would help ease the depression or ideation before going, nah, there's no empirical support for this because, quote, the craze is so new. After this, she turns to research indicating the opposite, including a longitudinal study of trans adults that found higher risks for mortality, suicidal behavior, and psychiatric morbidity after gender-confirming surgery. A leaked report from a UK gender clinic indicating self-harm and suicidality rates were not improved by puberty suppression in AFAB youth. A piece from The Guardian about the governor of that gender clinic quitting. A study that found normal levels of depression and slightly higher anxiety in socially transitioned children than in matched controls, which Shrier takes in-text issue for not having a before transition measure to compare against. And EndNote 22, which, because it's not a reference, we'll talk about in a sec. Anticipate, dear viewer. Let's dig in. Reference 18 is a longitudinal study covering data from 1973 to 2003 in Sweden. The authors note that part of the differences in death rates are due to a much larger difference prior to 1989. Also, the continuing mental health problems indicate that the psychiatric conditions need to be treated in addition to the gender dysphoria. Taking steps to fix the gender dysphoria are not going to automatically fix someone's depression. This does not support Shrier's claim that gender-affirming treatment isn't worth doing. I also want to point out that this paper is by the same lead author as one in Shrier's reference 16. That paper was a more recent general review of the published literature and indicated that overall, there were higher rates of psychiatric disorders and suicide attempts in the trans adult population than the cis, but also that these negative things decreased after gender-confirming treatment. Reference 19 is turning out to be a bitch to find. The information included by Shrier is insufficient in finding which board meeting she's talking about. Made even worse if this was leaked info, as she said. But, as in the last video with references on file with author, Shrier has not responded to an email requesting those materials, so this piece is inadmissible as is. Reference 20 talks about the governor resigning from Tavistock. I can understand concerns about the NHS being overworked and understaffed. When you have a backlog in the months, if not longer, triaging of time may start happening. I am woefully not knowledgeable about living in the UK or navigating its health system, and several people have tried explaining it to me, and it's kind of beside the point. But the name Tavistock may ring a bell, as it recently made world news with the UK court's decision that trans youth under 16 had loads more hoops to jump through in order to receive puberty blockers. The description box will have a link to a thorough discussion of what this court decision means. This study found roughly average mental health in socially transitioned youth with GID. And yeah, it would have been nice if they'd had before and after measures, but this is still a useful science puzzle piece. I'll remind you that Shrier's reference 9 did have before and after measures, and found that some things like emotional problems or depressive symptoms did drop between an appointment prior to starting puberty blockers and after having been on puberty blockers for some time. So, another little complementary puzzle piece there. This note from Shrier, it's like the bad universe version of the criticisms Littman got on her ROGD paper. It used self-report by the parents. The parents were biased because they let their kids transition. They had to carry through with the decision to let their kid transition, otherwise they'd look like an asshole. Nope, not supporting her scientific argument. So altogether, we have something by Zucker, missing everything else needed in a citation, a longitudinal study from Sweden indicating that mental health care needs to be a separate priority for trans adults, a damning table that is inadequately sourced, a news piece, a study indicating socially transitioned trans youth are doing as well as their matched peers, and a rant from Shrier. If we incorporate reference 16, we're left with it seeming that gender-confirming treatment may help lessen negative psychological states when present, but that treatment for that negative psychological state needs to occur in addition to gender-affirming care. Final ruling. Shrier's framing of this claim is misleading. The evidence presented ranges from being in line with the intent behind the claim to tangential, and the point behind the claim is seemingly misinterpreted by Shrier. Parents who are unsupportive of their child's trans identity should hear about the potential costs associated with their choice. Claim 4. Gender identity is immutable. You can't convert a child out of a transgender identity. Kaufman made the comparison between not being able to convert somebody out of their sexual orientation and not being able to convert somebody out of their gender identity, noting that conversion therapy has been banned in many locations. Shrier's argument about this is from a watchful waiting approach, described by her as, quote, a therapeutic process whose goal was to help a child grow more comfortable in their biological sex. As described here, it sounds like the Zucker approach. But if you look at the reference she has attached to the statistic that 70% of kids who question their gender grew out of it, it doesn't sound like kids are encouraged to embrace their assigned sex, but allowed to blossom in the way natural for them. Hence the watchful waiting, not watchful pruning. It even talks about parents having an accepting and supportive attitude towards gender dysphoria.
There are no long-term studies of desistance rates among those who had no childhood history of dysphoria, identified as transgender in adolescence, and underwent no social or medical transition. But there are a growing number of desisters and detransitioners among those who identified as transgender in adolescence, all of whom were quite passionate about their transgender identities until, quite suddenly, they weren't. Many of the desisters and detransitioners believed that they were influenced by their peers to identify as transgender. Later, once peer influence subsided or their own sense of self matured, they realized that they weren't actually transgender at all.
I imagine these studies she's wanting are hard to find because the participants would be hard to find. If someone never seeks treatment, and most of the recruitment seems to be done through gender clinics, that would make these people hard to find. Furthermore, if these people didn't do all of these things, how hard would it be for them to stop identifying as trans and detransition? And is Shrier saying that this group she's talking about belonged to that identified but not treated group? The link isn't clear to me there. I'd say give me proof, but there's a chapter focused on their stories later called The Regret. As touched on earlier, the rate of people changing their mind seems to be below 4%. And if we could understand if there's some common factors for people who ultimately end up detransitioning, maybe we could urge more caution for people who are showing those same factors before they transition themselves. But saying that all AFAB youth just don't get to transition because of that 4% risk seems unethical. Plus, this growing number is just sort of how statistics and numbers work. As time goes on, more people will experience X, and some people may drop out of X, but just as time, that number will grow. What's important is that the proportion or the percentage stays low, which it seems to be. Shrier's next argument is that being gay hasn't been able to be eliminated through socialization throughout human history, with many writers discussing their own gay feelings, but, quote, we don't have any similar weight of history telling us that we can't treat gender dysphoria. Wow, pulling the tradition card. That's a bold move that always goes well. Interesting fact. We had some pretty good trans-affirming research many years ago. Until the fucking Nazis burned it all. In the last video, I mentioned that trans people are not new. They've been around as long as cis people in various forms. Shrier is apparently ignorant of the many historical people who were trans. They lived their lives as best they could in the face of a culture that did not accept their identity. Shrier's next point of contention is David Reimer, who we discussed earlier. She notes that therapists and activists point to his case as indicating that a person's gender is what they say it is. But she counters this by saying that because David was biologically male, this proves nothing.
It was arguably David's biology that he couldn't escape, that not-so-minor detail stamped onto every cell of his body. not the ethereal concept gender, for which there is no scientific evidence.
Of course she'd see it this way, and of course she'd go back to the scientific marker argument for gender. Final ruling. Shrier's claim that you can convert a person out of a transgender identity is not substantiated besides her saying so the original claim stands. Final verdict. While Shrier did indicate some places where the research is lacking, she did not provide enough evidence to discard the gender-affirmative therapeutic approach. We wrap up this chapter with Shrier setting up the next one, the dissidents. Steel cuddles? No more video. Kitty scratch. It's my job now. She mentions that 19 states have banned conversion therapy of all forms, and somehow this means that a therapist questioning the, quote, self-diagnosis of gender dysphoria or suggesting that whatever dysphoria there was is not the patient's most significant problem could lose their license. I have to imagine that Shrier must think that therapists who are gender-affirming must just call everybody who walks through their door trans without talking to them first. It's normal to talk to your care provider about what you think might be going on. It gives you somewhere to start at least. And it's even part of how we book the appointment in the first place. Like, you call up or use the app. Hey, I'd like to book an appointment. Yeah, okay, what are we going to see you for? I think I might have an ear infection, something going on with my knee, gender dysphoria, something. Yeah, okay, we can see ya. We can fit you in whenever. Like, how is this supposed to work otherwise? She says that therapists who disagree with the affirmative care model have to stay quiet. Those who haven't are described as a lot of things. Bottom line, she's basically describing Zucker, Blanchard, and Bailey, plus her pocket Jungian analyst, Anne McHugh. The next chapter is going to be a real hoot. So, this chapter was basically Shrier arguing against gender-affirming treatment from a variety of angles. Unsuccessfully, in my opinion. And this was quite the journey to get through, so that's it for this video. See you all next time. Bye!